Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our sixth Thursdays for Justice series. Tonight, we're honored to have Mark Alan Segal, an American journalist, activist, and writer, with us. Mr. Segal participated in the Stonewall riots as one of the original founders of the Gay Liberation Front, where he created the Gay Youth Program. He also was the founder and former president of the National Gay Newspaper Guild and the founder and publisher of the Philadelphia Gay News. And he's won numerous journalism awards for his column, Mark My Works. Mr. Segal also partnered with the Obama administration to create and build the nation's first official LGBT-friendly senior affordable housing building, a $19.8 million project known as the John C. Anderson Apartments, which opened in 2013. Please join me in welcoming Mark Segal. Mark.
Thank you, and happy Pride to everybody there. Do you want to start out, or do you want me to just do a...
You're on.
I'm on. Okay. So I guess I should tell you a little about me, who I am, and how I found myself where I am today. I grew up in the 1950s and 60s. Now you're saying, but you don't look that old. Yeah, that's called good genes. Thank you, Mom, Dad, Grandma, and Grandpa. I'm 70 years old now. So growing up at that time, if you just happened to think that you were gay, you thought there was something very negative, because being gay meant you didn't know anything about yourself, because it was something that in polite society you weren't allowed to talk about. So therefore, if you went to the library to try to figure out who you were, you might find, if you were lucky, 5 books. And those 5 books would tell you that you were immoral. They would tell you you're illegal. They would tell you you're medically unsound. They would tell you you might need treatment in a mental institution. You are unemployable. All those great, wonderful things that are self-assuring. And the problem being is, once you hear all those things, who do you talk to about it? In those days, you had no one to talk about it. Remember, there was no internet, no cable TVs. And because it was such a subject that was not talked about, you couldn't read about it in a newspaper or magazine. Talk shows didn't talk about it on TV or radio. You just didn't exist. And the little things you did hear about gay people was always negative. The only images of gay people in media were they were insane, they were criminals, and they killed themselves. That was it. So for some odd reason, growing up in my teens in the 1960s, I knew I was gay, but I didn't think I was any of those things. And I kept thinking, what's wrong with me? Or what I didn't say was, what's wrong with them? Maybe I should have. But I knew there was nothing wrong with me, or at least I believed that. And I just didn't understand it. So I found out that there was this place in New York called Greenwich Village, where all these counterculture people were, and hippies. I figured, there has to be people like me in New York. So when I got out of high school, graduation, I hightailed it to New York. Date still fresh in my memory, May 10th, 1969. That was my Freedom Day. And I decided, okay, let me go look for those people that are like me somewhere in the Village. Village is a very big place in New York. And when you get off the subway, there are no big neon signs which say, hey, this way to the gay people. So you have to look around. But eventually I found Christopher Street, which in those days was the heart of the gay community. And like any good teenager, you hang out every night. And for me, every night meant going back to Christopher Street, walking up and down that street from Greenwich all the way down to the river and back again all night long with my friends, sitting on stoops, going into the Silver Dollar to get a cup of coffee if it was one season, and a cup of soup if it was another. But one thing that always happened was, in those early days, at the end of the evening or late in the evening, you would end up at a place called the Stonewall. And the reason you ended up in Stonewall was very simple. Out on the streets, it was dangerous. The danger came from not only the thugs that might come down to beat up the fags, but it also came from the police. Police, as a gay person, we were not allowed to congregate. If drag queens were on the street, and they always were, if they didn't have more than 3 pieces of the correct sex objects that they were wearing, they could be arrested. So police were constantly coming down and harassing us on the street. And when I say constantly, I mean every single hour. Not an hour went by when we were not harassed. But there was so you went into the Stonewall and you had peace. You felt safe. But there was another reason you went to Stonewall. You could dance. And what 18-year-old doesn't like to dance their ass off? And it was the only place you could dance. So I would go there every single night, as would most of my friends. So on that night, on the 27th of June, I'd only been in New York 6 weeks, and I'm in the bar, and the lights flicker on and off. As they flicker on and off, I look over at my friend, I go, "What's going on?" And they tell me it's a raid. Now, you got to remember, in those days, it was common for a raid to happen in a place like Stonewall. The police took payoffs. That was the purpose. And during election time, of course, the politicians always wanted to say they were cleaning up the town. So usually what would happen is police would come in, they take a few bucks, and they walk out. That was the end of it. Not that night. That night, a man by the name of Officer Pine was in charge of the raid. He was from Brooklyn, not Manhattan. And he decided that he wanted to bust the mafia that ran the bar and get those drag queens. So he came in with full force. And he did interviews later in life. And you could read most of this in the book Stonewall. And he decided he was going to destroy the place. He was going to destroy the bar. He was going to destroy the jukebox. It would never open again. So he and his men came in, not just walking in as for funds. They burst the doors open, walked in, slammed people up against the walls, called them every kind of profanity you could possibly imagine. If you look like you were successful, they would tell you to take your wallet out, take your money. Drag queens and masculine women got the worst of their brunt. Once they'd done all the damage they could, and once they had humiliated as many people as they could, they decided to let us out. So they would card us. I was one of the first ones to be let out. Remember, I had only been in New York for 6 weeks. I looked like the guy next door. I had no money, so they couldn't, extort me. They want to yell at me. Big deal. So I got let out. Eventually, as people started getting out, we would hang around the front doors. Eventually, there were about 50 of us around the front doors in sort of like a horseshoe shape. And at that point, Pine was left in the bar with about 5 officers, about 4 to 6 people who worked at the bar, and 4 drag queens he was holding that he was going to arrest. We had 50 people outside, and we weren't leaving. The only people who did leave are those people who had a decent job or had family in the area. And the reason they left is if you got arrested at a gay bar in New York, your name would appear in a newspaper. You most likely would have lost your job, and you might have lost your family, or both. So the only people who were left on the street at that point were people like me, homeless people, street kids, drag queens, and the underprivileged. We were the ones who stayed behind. So at one point, Pine decides to leave the bar. He opens the door, and everybody who was there started throwing coins or soda cans they found on the street, or little stones, whatever they had. He quickly closed the door. That was attempted several times. From that point on, the stories go every which way. And so here's what I have to tell you as a person who was there is none of us who were there can tell you the complete story, because it started at approximately 12 o'clock and didn't end until 3 a.m. And it went up and down Christopher Street from Greenwich all the way down to the river. So nobody was there at one point, but we all did different things. So the thing that I did that night, which I'm become more and more proud of as the years go on, and thought was a very little itty thing when I did it, a man by the name of Marty Robinson, who to me is the hero of that, one of the heroes of that first year of gay liberation, came up and gave me a piece of chalk. And he said, right on the street and right on the buildings, all up and down Christian Street, tomorrow, Stonewall. That, doing that created the second night of Stonewall. I'm not sure where in that whole first night it happened, but I know it's somewhere during that first night. I stood outside the bar watching the circus around me. It was a little crazy at times, and quite honestly, full of joy. And I know that might shock people to hear there's fires going on, there's police sirens, people running around, windows breaking, and I'm saying full of joy. The point being is we were fighting back for the first time. We were standing out and shouting that we are proud of who we are. And that filled us with joy. Uh, so sometime during that point, when I'm feeling that joy, and I know it was just an instant, I'm saying to myself, you know, this is the counterculture 60s. We've just gone through some incredible years of assassination and riots and demonstrations. Women are fighting for their rights. Latinos are fighting for their rights. Blacks are fighting for their rights. What about us? And it was at that moment that I decided that is what I would be doing the rest of my life. And basically, I have. But I often wonder why that happened to me. And and I talk about it in my memoir. Here, I'm going to do a plug. Here's a plug. This is my memoir. You can get it on Amazon. And then I dance. And yes, that is me being arrested on the cover. But what I talk about in my memoir is that I'm lucky to have had my grandmother, whose name was Fanny Weinstein. Fanny, when she was a little girl, her family lived in Russia, and they lived in a Jewish village. And the village was often ransacked by the Russian authorities, which they did to Jews all the time. Those were called pogroms. Fanny's parents decided, you know, we don't like this too much. And luckily for me, they left and came to the United States. My grandmother, then when she was a 20-year-old, became a suffragette. And then in the 1960s, she joined the civil rights movement. And when I was 13, she took me to my first civil rights demonstration, picketing around Philadelphia City Hall with Cecil B. Moore when I first met him. And I think that's what instilled who I am and what I am today, and why I was able to say, that's what I'm going to do. So from writing on the streets, tomorrow night, Stonewall, the second night, Marty Robinson and Martha Shelley were able to speak from the front of those burned doors of Stonewall. That in itself was illegal. Gay people were congregating. We were ignoring the police. We were giving speeches. That was illegal. Every single night from that point on, we made it clear that that was our neighborhood. We were taking back our neighborhood. Over the next year, we demonstrated at the police station, at media outlets. We put out newspapers. For the first time, we created medical alerts, legal alerts, created the first trans organization, created the first gay youth organization, created the first LGBT community center. And if all that were not enough, we joined with others to create the Christian Street Liberation Day Committee, which created the world's first gay pride in June of 1970 to commemorate all that we had done that year, and specifically Stonewall. And if you would ask me, and I say this, each time I say this, I get chills and more proud. For me, pride is probably America's LGBT community's best export to the world, because it's used everywhere in the world now. So think of it this way. When we did that first Pride, we had no idea how many people would show up, since anything before that first Pride only had 42, at the most 100 people. At that first Pride, we had anywhere between 3 and 15,000 people. Today, if you look at Pride around the world, it's tens of millions. That's a wonderful gift that this country has given to the world. And how's it being used? Well, in Taiwan, it was used to get marriage equality, and it worked. So Taiwan became the first Asian country to have marriage equality. In Istanbul, the country is trying to clamp down on its LGBT community and won't allow them to have parades. So what do? They march anyway, which is, by the way, is what we did in New York that first year. The police did not want to give us a permit. In the end, they did give us a permit, but we told them we were going to march whether they gave it to us or not. So it's now been 52 years for me. And in those 52 years, I've got to watch changes that I never expected would come about. And I've gotten to be involved in various aspects of our community growing. But I look upon that first year as the first magic year of gay liberation. Now, mind you, I could give you a 1-minute lecture in the history of LGBT rights, and you might be surprised where it started. I would usually ask if we were in it all together. I would ask, anybody know when the gay rights struggle started? And a lot of people would say various dates, and most likely everybody in the audience would be wrong. The gay rights struggle started in 1895 in Berlin, Germany, by a man by the name of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. Usually people say, 1895? Are you serious? It didn't come to the United States until 1922, and the first organization being registered in Chicago, Illinois by Henry Gerver. Then came the Mattachine Society in the 1950s, along with Daughters of Bilitis, and several others throughout the 50s and 60s. That's a quick little history of how our movement has grown. So the reason I give you that quick little history lesson is because in the back of my mind, I'm always hearing TV and news anchor people saying the day that marriage equality won, saying, gee, look how quick this movement got to marriage equality. Sorry, 1895, not so quick. And there's a lot of horrendous things that went in between, which of course I'm leaving out of this because I'm full of joy because of where we are today. And if I say today specifically, I guess I'd have to talk about what happened specifically today. For those of you who are watching who haven't seen the news tonight, Supreme Court made a ruling today in a case called Fulton versus Philadelphia. It was considered a major case, and the ruling is a little upended at the moment. So basically what the case is the Catholic charities in Philadelphia would not allow LGBT married couples to adopt or foster children. And they said because it was their religious liberty, because they did not accept marriage amongst people of the same sex. Philadelphia refused to fund them. They sued Philadelphia. One of the couples did. That's why it's Fulton versus Philadelphia rather than Catholic Charities, but it's out of Catholic Charities. The court today ruled 9-0, by the way, that Catholic Charities had the right to do that, but not because of religious liberties. If you read, I'm going to read this to you. I've been doing this all day, so if you excuse me, my paperwork is all over here. I got it. So if you read the opinion that came down, the opinion stated that it was a First Amendment issue, and the reason they sided with Fulton was because the law in Philadelphia wasn't written properly. So does that mean if it was written properly, the city was okay in taking money away from Catholic charities. So if you want to know how strong and narrow the ruling is, let me quote from the opinion Judge Alito, who's one of the most conservative members of the bench. And you'll note he's not happy with the ruling. He states, the court omitted a wisp of a decision which leaves religious liberty confused and at a vulnerable state. So I think the court knew what it was doing. It didn't want to, as Judge Alito states here, support religious liberty, but at the same time, it didn't want to give the LGBT community a win. So it basically went down the middle. This is going to be, we in the gay community have seen this before happen with the Supreme Court. It happened on numerous cases of sodomy. In the 1980s, the Berger Court, believe it or not, said it was still illegal to have sodomy and sided with Georgia, the state of Georgia, to arrest gay people. That no longer is the case, obviously. But the court earlier this year had made two incredible rulings regarding LGBT issues. So this time they were not sure where to go. I'm not a lawyer, so please watch your favorite law show tonight to get their reading on it. But with that, I guess I've been speaking for about 25 minutes now. So I'd rather go and hear what questions or discussions you would like. I'm always interested in hearing what people who are here to hear me wish to talk about.
I think we have a question from Dave and Ellen Green.
Oh, I was just wondering, when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of gay marriage, it was such a, I remember where we were. It was such a huge thing. We were in Denver, Colorado, and we ran up to the state capitol building, and it's a huge celebration, and everybody was crying. And so I was wondering where you were and what your feelings were.
I was here at home, and I was full of joy. My now husband, Jason, and I hugged each other. We've been together for 12 years before that, now 17 years, because it's 5 years since then. And we often talked about marriage. And if you recall, at that time, marriage was being allowed in some states and other states it wasn't. And I had made a decision because of who I am. And I often told Jason, I will not get married until I can do it in my own state. I believe in full equality. I'm not going to go running out of state to get married. I'm doing it in my own state. And by the way, thanks to some work we did with our governor here in the state, we were Tom Corbett, who is a Tea Party Republican. We got marriage equality a year before the rest of the country, before that ruling in Pennsylvania. So we did make it happen. But so when that came down, my phone started ringing off the hook. And one of the first people who called was the Register of Wills. That's the person who does marriage certificates in Philadelphia. And he asked if I would like to be at the office the following morning and hand out marriage license.
Fun.
Nice.
So I attempted to do that. I was not good on a city computer. They didn't work too well for me. But on the way over to City Hall, Jason said to me, "What about us?" I said, "Well, I guess we'll get one while we're there today." And the funny thing is, in Philadelphia City Hall, and I hope they've changed this rule, you need to buy your license with cold, hard cash. No credit cards were accepted then. So we get there, and I left the house without my wallet, without anything. We were so excited about doing that. And strangely enough, walking into the room came Jim Kenney, now mayor of Philadelphia. And I have a picture up there somewhere. I'm in my den. Jim Kenney and Ron DeChico, who was Register Will, chipped in and they paid for our wedding license.
Nice.
So it was a cheerful, great day, and I got a great story from it. So.
If anyone has a question, just take yourself off mute and feel free to ask at a break. Mark, a question we have is, during the Stonewall riots, those first 2 or 3 nights, did you know the change that you were making?
Absolutely not. Number one, it was spontaneous, and people often ask what it was about that night or why then. And I think it was a combination of so many different things. It was a hot night. The police were horrible in the way they came in. It was 1969, the end of a decade where we had seen assassination and war, and America was, in a mental basket. Everybody else in the world was fighting for their rights. Why shouldn't we roll all those things together? And then you also have people who felt like me, who didn't understand what was wrong with society. There's nothing wrong with me. Why can't I live a typical life? And so I think we were prepared and ready at that point to ask questions, because the rest of the society already was about so many other issues. It was the time when we as a people, all of us in America, were questioning authority. And so I think the time for us to revolt was that night. And by revolting, we did. I mean, from the ashes of Stonewall came Gay Liberation Front. Gay Liberation Front changed the world for gay people. Gay Liberation Front's first thing that we did was state that society wasn't going to label us. We would identify ourselves. We were going to be out loud and proud of who we were. Those things changed immediately. And aside from that, we were also going to create a community. The police were only allowed to come in and destroy and raid bars because we had no community. Up until that point, there were only 4 places that gay people could meet. You could meet in illegal bars like Stonewall. You can meet maybe one of the 10 gay organizations there were around the country, where only 10 to 15 people were members because they were afraid of getting their name into the paper. You can meet in cruise places or private parties. That was it. So we decided to create a community. That's why we created gay youth organizations, trans organizations, a community center. We created collectives. Today, when I look at what we call gay community and see that we have youth organizations that own their own buildings, medical clinics, churches, synagogues, we have built a full-fledged community. And as Michael, as you said earlier, I'm very proud to have been part of building the first affordable senior housing complex. And so what I like to say is my joke to myself anyway, especially now that I'm 70 years old. So part of my big thing in Gay Liberation Front was that I started Gay Youth, the first gay youth organization. So I started the first gay youth organization. Now I'm pioneering senior housing for gays. So I like to think of myself as cradle to grave.
Are there any other questions?
Well, I would just like to thank you for what you've done to make life so much better for LGBTQ kids now, who have such a different, I think, experience than you did. But not all of them do, right? Depending on where they live and what their families are like.
Absolutely.
And I'd like to know more about what your family was like and how your experience affects what we should all know in dealing with gay kids now and helping them.
I was really lucky. I guess 2 sides of that question. So my earliest memory of my parents and the subject matter, we'd gone to visit relatives and I was in the back seat. And I want to say I was approximately 9 years old. I'm not quite sure. I don't remember. Obviously, I was too young. I was supposedly sleeping in the back seat. My mother and father were driving home in the front. And they were talking about my cousin, Norman. Name was Norman Reber. Norman's father had beat him up and thrown him out of the house when he was 16-year-old because he was gay. And they were talking about that. And while, and my father used the word, my mother said, how could anyone do that to their child? And my father said he was queer. I remember that very clearly. And my mother said, it doesn't matter. He should not have done that. And she was very sympathetic. My father was somewhat sympathetic, but not completely. That was my first. So that's how you ingrain something into a child. Knowing, well, how are your parents going to be if they found out you're like that? When I did tell them, I was very brave about it. I was living in New York. I called them on the phone. And strangely enough, my father got on the phone first. I said, Dad, I have something to talk to you about. And he said, what? I said, I just want to let you know I'm gay. He says, yeah, I think I already knew that. Here, talk to your mother. Not the answer I expected, and my mother's, excuse me. And my mother's reaction was, Mark, I love you, but I'm really concerned about you when you're old, that you'll be lonely. And so I understood that, but so that's what my relationship was with them. I was living in New York and they were back in Philadelphia. My mother became ill, and my father asked me to move back to Philadelphia. And he said, you could continue to do those gay activist things you're doing when you get back to Philadelphia, but I would like you to come and help out with your mom. So I did. And then I got involved in some things which got me a few headlines. Long story short, one day I did something which got me a lot of publicity, and I got a call from the Phil Donahue show, and I did the show. And they called me a few months later and they said, we'd like you to come back, but would you bring your parents? And I asked my mom and dad, and my mom and dad went with me, and we're on the Phil Donahue show. And I think it's the first time a real family was on TV together. That was 1973. Yeah, and I don't have a copy of that tape, unfortunately. And it's one of the saddest things in my life to me, because I really wish I did. And I'm a member of Comcast Joint Diversity Council, and as you know, they own NBC. And as a favor to me, they went searching for the tape. And as Phil Donahue told me, and I didn't believe him, he said he put a bunch of tapes in a warehouse, and the warehouse caught fire, and it had disappeared in there. Turns out he was correct. That's what did happen to them. But my parents were great. I don't think I could be who I am today without my parents. They were extremely supportive. When I think about it today and look back on it, I'm thinking what it must have been like for them to go to cousins clubs or what have you. And when the relatives would talk, I saw your son in the paper. What is this stuff he's doing? Why is he doing it? Why is he embarrassing the family? They never once came to me and mentioned that. Never once. And of course, I only realized that after they were gone. That's how accepting they were and how secure they wanted me to feel.
What advice would you give to gay youth or even adults that don't have that experience?
First off, I would say you're lucky you have something that I didn't have, which is this wonderful thing called the internet. I would get on it. I would research everything I possibly wanted to know about myself. But more importantly, I would discover where there are support groups where people who are like-minded would be helpful to me. And specifically, I would find gay youth organizations so that I can have people my own age to talk with. We're lucky that you have one up there in Bucks County. We have one down here in Philadelphia called The Attic. Those are great organizations. They and Gay Straight Alliances in high schools all across the country are incredible organizations. And I would tell the kid, if you don't have a Gay Straight Alliance in your school, get a hold of the organization, and they might be able to help you start one in your school. And the great thing about Gay Straight Alliances, you can say you're straight and start one. So you can even be in the closet. And there's nothing wrong with that. Most gay people are in the closet for, first few years of their lives. Because
we have the Rainbow Room here in Doylestown as well.
Yeah, it's great.
Can you tell us what do you see as the top issues facing the gay and lesbian community now, and how people can get involved in those?
Well, there's several. On a legal standpoint, the first important one is the Equality Act, which has been passed by Congress, but thanks to the Republicans, is stalled in the United States Senate. That law will add sexual orientation and gender identity to the classes of people that cannot be discriminated against, such as race, creed, religion, national origin, sex. I'm sure all of you know that list. We would like sexual orientation and gender identity to be included in that. Pennsylvania does not have a non-discrimination law. Therefore, in the state of Pennsylvania, you could get married today, and then when you go for your honeymoon up in the Poconos, they can refuse to give you a hotel room. That literally can happen to you. There are, I think it's 26 boroughs and counties and cities in Pennsylvania that have non-discrimination laws. But as a state, we do not. And if your borough, county, city does not, you could be fired, you could be refused housing, you could be refused public accommodations. So if the law passed in the United States Senate, that would cover the entire nation, just like the Supreme Court ruling on marriage covers the complete United States. So in a legal way, that's the most important thing we could do. On the other hand, if we're looking at our community, the most important thing we can do right now is to help the most endangered. And the most endangered in our community right now are trans people, especially trans people of color. The best way for me to explain this, because people say, why are so many trans people being hurt and persecuted and oppressed? The best way I can give you, or my analysis of it, is that it's basically a backlash against the entire LGBT community. But those people who wanted the backlash against the gay lesbian community can't do that anymore because everybody knows who we are anymore. But they use trans people as their boogeyman now because society doesn't know them. So in a sense, they're the whipping post for all of us. That's why the rest of the LGBT community has to stand up for them and help them. And the best thing they can do for themselves